Today's episode of Between the Covers is brought to you in part by Vancouver Manuscript Intensive, a literary mentoring program that pairs authors with mentors in their genre. Set in Vancouver, BC, the online program is open to writers around the world who seek sustained mentorship for their works in progress. VMI offers several options for supporting emerging and experienced authors, including a 6-month intensive cohort that runs January to July, shorter packages of individual mentoring available year-round, a program for published authors who need a sounding board or brainstorming, and the Josef Wosk VMI Fellowship for a writer of exceptional promise who has faced significant barriers. The application deadline for the fellowship and for the 6-month program is November 9th. Please visit vancouvermanuscriptintensive.com for more information about pairing with a mentor to hone your project. Today's episode is also brought to you by Brittany Rogers' debut poetry collection, Good Dress, a stunning exploration of the extravagant beauty of Black relationships, language, and community, called Audacious, Grounded, and Generous by Danica Kelly, and a once-in-a-generation debut by Angel Nafis. Good Dress explores autonomy and selfhood, reflecting on the forces that have shaped and formed Brittany Rogers' life. Says Erika Foreman, exploring gentrification, queer eroticism, motherhood, and church girl blues, Brittany Rogers makes it her business to insist we look at it all, the catastrophe and the beauty, and leave none of its wisdom behind. Good Dress is out October 15th from Tin House and available for pre-order now. Longtime listeners of the show know that sometimes I air craft talks recorded live at the Tin House Writers' Workshops, and today's lecture is from this last summer, a talk that leapt out to both me and the director of the workshops, Lance Cleland, as one of the most unforgettable talks of the week. The talk by Torrey Peters is on what she calls strategic opacity, and it's really not to be missed, so I'm glad you're here. Torrey Peters' debut novel, Detransition Baby, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Awards, a finalist for the Brooklyn Public Library Award, longlisted for the Women's Prize for Fiction, and it won the 2021 Penn Hemingway Award. Her next book, Stag Dance, a novel and stories, comes out March of next year. She has an MFA from the University of Iowa and a master's in comparative literature from Dartmouth, rides a pink motorcycle, and splits her time between Brooklyn and an off-grid cabin in Vermont. If you listen to this and are hungry for more, there are tons of Tin House Live episodes in the archive, from Alexander Chee's talk, From First Draft to Plot, Lacey M. Johnson on likability, Ingrid Rojas Contreras on power and audience and on not writing for white people, Jericho Brown on suicide and joy, and the most listened to talk by Matilda Bernstein Sycamore called Writing on Your Own Terms, just to name a few. Beyond the summer and winter writers' workshops, Tin House offers residencies as well as ongoing online craft seminars with 7 or 8 upcoming this fall alone. You can find out about all of these at tinhouse.com/workshop. Lastly, before we hand this over to Torrey, if you enjoy Between the Covers, either as a first-time or long-time listener, consider transforming yourself from a listener to a listener supporter by joining the Between the Covers community. Every supporter can join our collective ongoing brainstorm of who to invite in the future. Every listener supporter gets resources related to each episode. And then there are a ton of other things to choose from, including the bonus audio archive, which includes contributions from everyone from Matilda Bernstein Sycamore reading from their upcoming book, Pterodactyl, to C.A. Conrad reading Memories of Why I Stopped Being a Man, a 3-part essay where each of the 3 parts begins with the Ursula Le Guin quote from Left Hand of Darkness, a subsequent autobiographical essay by C.A. Conrad, and then one of their poems. There's also the Tin House Early Reader subscription, getting 12 books over the course of a year, months before they're available to the general public. This and many, many, many other things. You can check all of them out at patreon.com/betweenthecovers. And now for today's craft talk on strategic opacity with Torrey Peters.
Thank you very much. Sorry about the special effects that I was planning for the finale. It was going to be like, and that's literature, and then, but I guess literature already happened. Thank you all so much for coming. I have been very moved by the way that other people have opened up their lectures and their readings. Just talking about Palestine, talking about Sudan. It led me to reflect about, obviously I'm trans, and that's tradition I come from, but I think about the fact that many of the trans luminaries started out their careers talking about, kind of trans issues. I'm thinking of Leslie Feinberg, I'm thinking about Dean Spade, and they kind of ended they haven't ended Dean Spade has not ended his career, just to say, but have moved on in their career to Palestine, and have thought, speak more often about Palestine and the ways that the issues are always interconnected, and in fact, to understand one, oftentimes the best way is to understand a different issue. So I am just really grateful to the people who know much more about it than me, and the way that they've spoken about it and moved me. And I really appreciate also the way that Lance began this series. So I just want to start out by expressing that appreciation. This lecture is called Strategic Opacity, which is a very opaque title. And it's, I had this idea that it was like a term that people knew, but I think it's not at all. So I'm going to try and explain what it is and why I've been thinking about it a lot. And I'm going to speak somewhat extemporaneously because this is kind of an ongoing thought in my own head, and I want to kind of share the process that I've been going through. There's a timer here. Just because I'm speaking extemporaneously, I want to make sure I keep it on time. The process that I've been going through in my head as I think about this. What happened to me that got me thinking about what I later started calling strategic opacity is I wrote this book called Detransition Baby. For you who haven't read it, let me just quickly give you the plot. There's this trans woman named Reese, and she's kind of a mess. She's in Brooklyn, and her ex, Ames, who used to be a trans woman named Amy, but detransitioned, gets his boss pregnant, Katrina, who's a cis woman, and then proposes to Katrina that Reese share motherhood in a kind of unconventional triad. And that's basically the first chapter. That's like the setup, and then the book kind of goes from there. So when I brought it first to agents and editors, I got two questions always. Always I got, well, why would Reese want to be a mother? Like, show us that Reese wanted to be a mother. And this question always annoyed me so much because I was like, well, why does anybody want to be a mother? Like, what do you mean, like, show us that Reese wants to be a mother? Then I added this whole thing in the book about, well, why does anybody want to be a mother? Why do cis women want to be mothers? Like, why is it a special case for trans women that they should want to be mothers? And then the second question I got was, well, why would Katrina ever entertain this proposition? Like if your ex came to you and was like, hey, guess what? I used to be a trans woman. I detransitioned. You're pregnant unexpectedly, and I'd like to share the baby with my ex, which is the proposition. Why would Katrina not just be like, get away from me? And that continued to these two questions continued to sort of hound the book. And my answer to the Katrina thing was like, well, like, this is the beginning of the story. It's necessary for it to take place. Like, when you see Armageddon, do you go like, why does the asteroid come towards the Earth? I wanted to be like, this is what it takes to start a story. We're just going to go with it. But then Detransition Baby got optioned for a television show at Amazon. It's not getting made, but I did write scripts for it, and I went through a whole process. I learned a lot. But if these were problems in the publishing industry, they were so extreme when it came to television. Like, every single executive that saw it was like, okay, but when are we going to see Reese like cuddling a baby and being like, I love babies so much, And they would like try and present it to me like this was like really simple. It's like, we've never seen a trans woman cuddling a baby. Like, we're gonna break new ground here. And I wanted the show to get made, so I was like, yeah, like, so many babies cuddled. We'll do it every episode, But underneath all that, I was increasingly frustrated. And although I felt like my answers were good, in a sort of philosophical terms of the internet, my answers were both whataboutisms. They were like, instead of sort of like, well, I can tell you narratively why Reese wants to be a mother, or I can tell you why Katrina had to do this, I would say, well, what about cis women? And I would point elsewhere for my answer, instead of being able to point to the text and say, this is why it has to be this way. For Katrina, I'd say, what about Armageddon? I felt sort of righteous in what my answers were, but like that righteousness wasn't like, it didn't sort of settle me as a writer to be like, I have an answer that exists outside of political context. Not that everything should exist outside of political context, but for me personally, it troubled me. So then I happened to be reading, and I want to apologize for this lecture having a lot to do with Shakespeare, because it's like, I realize people are trying to get away from the canon, and this is the most canon that's ever canoned. But I happened to be reading a biography of Shakespeare because I oftentimes like to understand, like, why are books chosen like this way? Why are people talking about this stuff? How can we compare this sort of thing? So I was like, I wanted to know, like, who was Shakespeare? And I came to this section on Hamlet and why Hamlet actually makes no sense as a play. And I realized that the fact that Hamlet makes no sense was actually the answer to my problems. That Shakespeare actually had the same problem as I did, which is like, your play makes no sense, how are we going to do it? Why is it in the text? So if you'll indulge me, I'd like to take some time and explain why Hamlet makes no sense. Essentially, there are three Hamlets, or there have been, but by the time Shakespeare wrote Hamlet, there were already two before. The first, which I think is worth going through, was by, it's really obnoxious that I'm talking about Shakespeare and writing on a blackboard, I know, but just bear with me. Saxo the Grammarian, who was a 12th century Dane, and if anyone has seen the movie Northman with Alexander Skarsgård, that's actually based on the Saxo the Grammarian telling of Hamlet. And in the Saxo the Grammarian telling, the Danish telling, there's the king, who's King Hamlet in Hamlet, is King Horvendil, I believe it's pronounced. I'm not sure about that. King Horvendil. The Claudius, the brother, is Fang. And Gertrude is Gerutha. Hamlet is Amleth. So I'm just going to switch to those names for right now, but that's the correspondence. And the way that the Saxo the Grammarian plot works is that Fang, the brother, murders in the open King Horvendil with the excuse that he was abusing his wife And then Fang marries Garutha, and everybody knows. There's no like secret about it. It's just like he announces, "You're doing this. I don't like it," and it's a pretext in the play's telling, and I'm going to kill you. So he kills them, and that's pretty much that. And then because it's like an honor and revenge society, the one problem is the son Amleth, who everybody knows is going to grow up and want to take revenge because his father was killed and he's supposed to avenge it. And so Fang is like, actually, also we're going to kill this, at the time, this young boy, Amleth. And so what Amleth does is Amleth pretends to be insane. Amleth takes like slime and like pours slime over himself, like goes, like covers himself in like dirt and like goes down to the beach, stops talking to anybody, and starts whittling these little hooks, these like tiny little hooks. And the whole story is basically Fang going to Amleth and being like, "I know you're not really insane, but you do seem to be whittling a lot of little hooks." and you can't really get them. And then like 12 years pass of whittling hooks. And then it turns out what the hooks are for is a big net, which Amleth puts the big net over the house in which Fang is staying with like his friends, sets it afire, and then stabs everybody who tries to come out. And that's Hamlet. And which, is funny because that's the precursor for the play that's supposed to be all about deep interiority. And I don't know if you noticed when The Northman came out, it was not like really big on interiority. Not to be a film critic, but that was my take. So that's the basic plot of Hamlet. That's where it started. And then there was one other Hamlet in between, which is Hamlet was written in 1600, but there was another play it's lost to history, but we know it exists from the record, by Thomas Kyd, K-Y-D. No one really knows what's in it, but what everybody supposes is the ghost that shows up in Hamlet was actually the invention of Kyd, not sort of to be, cast doubt on what happened. It's just that Kyd really liked ghosts. So, like all of his plays, like the Spanish tragedy and the other well-known plays that still exist, they had ghosts, and the ghosts were more just like thrilling to the audience. It was like a ghost, who can argue with that? So then, basically 10 years later, really for money, Shakespeare was like, I'm gonna write Hamlet. His son Hamnet had died like 4 years earlier. There's a book that won the Women's Prize, like all about that, Hamnet. It came out like a couple years ago. But he's starting to change his style. He's adding soliloquies to his plays, and most notably in Richard II and Julius Caesar, he starts having these characters, instead of sort of announce things, start doubting within themselves. So he's interested suddenly in doubt. And with that, he's like, well, I'm going to stage Hamlet. And his big intervention, Shakespeare's, was that he made the murder a secret. So whereas Fang was just like, I killed Horvendale, Claudius secretly poisons King Hamlet. And this changes everything. Or it seems like it should change everything. But then it really doesn't. Because basically nobody knows. They think that it was a serpent. They think a serpent had bitten King Hamlet. So life kind of goes on. All of Denmark's like, oh, it's sad about the serpent. And then the only reason that Hamlet knows is the ghost, which was Kyd's invention, shows up and says, let's see, I've got it here, what he says, the serpent that did sting thy father's life now wears the crown. So he then tells him, and he says it was murder most foul, which is where that phrase I didn't realize until I started doing this lecture. I was like, I love to say murder most foul, and I was like, oh, it's Hamlet. So the only reason that Hamlet knows is that a ghost appeared and told him. And meanwhile, Claudius doesn't think that anything's amiss. Like Hamlet's like, I'm going to go to university, and Claudius is like, no, why don't you stay and chill? You're like our chiefest courtier cousin and son. So rather than, as Fang was like, I'm afraid of Hamlet, Claudius is trying to keep him close. So it seems like the answer to this play is that Hamlet knows, his dad's like, get revenge, and Claudius is like, here I am, right? So then what should happen is the same thing happened before, is that Hamlet then kills Claudius, and that's the end of the play. That's what makes sense plot-wise. It should end basically in Act 1. That's what makes sense. And instead, what happens, and Hamlet even says so. Like, I won't do too many Shakespeare quotations for you, but Hamlet basically says as much. He says, "May I sweep to my revenge." But then he doesn't sweep to his revenge. That's not what happens. Instead, he says he's going to put on an antic disposition, which means basically he's going to pretend to be insane, which is left over from the Saxo the Grammarian play, right? But that doesn't make any sense. The whole play actually doesn't make any sense for this, because why would he pretend to be insane? Nobody suspects him of anything. It was a ghost who told him there was a murder. There's no reason to pretend to be insane. It makes no sense whatsoever. And the entire play is based on this decision that is inexplicable. This is the opacity that we're going to begin to explore. The book that I was reading, which is Stephen Greenblatt's Will in the World, argues that there was this decision that made Hamlet a really different play from the ones that came before. Because essentially, Hamlet becomes both suspended in doubt and unknowable. And that unknowableness translates to the stage. So there was a coherent plot. Shakespeare wrecks the coherent plot. We figure that he knows what he's doing. But the next act just involves Hamlet going around pretending to be insane, drawing the suspicion of the very people who he shouldn't. Claudius is like, Hamlet's acting really weird. And, then he's like, goes to Gertrude and he's like, I think your son's strange. And says to Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, Hamlet's friends, like, let's keep an eye on him, checks with Polonius. And so the choice to do this not only makes no sense, but it makes everything that Hamlet goes through more difficult. And then the weirder thing happens, which is that even though Hamlet's told us that he's going to pretend to be insane, he starts believing that he's insane himself, right? So like the famous lines, to be or not to be, should I commit suicide? I feel really sad. That's a direct quote from Shakespeare. We remember that even though it doesn't make sense, because Hamlet essentially has convinced himself. And so what ends up happening in this play is by excising the reason for him to pretend to be mad, the entire play becomes about the interiority of madness. So that we feel, by it making no sense, we feel that there's something going on inside of this character. And in fact, the ghosts and all this stuff kind of just disappears. There's a line in it that's interesting that's like, that Hamlet has so far forgotten his dead dad as to speak of death as the undiscovered country from whose bourne no traveler returns. Well, he can't possibly believe that because he just talked to his dead dad, right? There's all these things that are contradictions that make no sense whatsoever. And to me, I read this and I was like, oh, I think this is actually the explanation for what I'm doing. That other people are in fact, do these things that make no sense and are unknowable and are completely opaque. And it's because of that, I tend to feel that they have something going on inside of them. It's their inexplicableness rather than the motive that, Hollywood executives demand that makes me understand them as full people. Because generally when you encounter another, you can't know what they're thinking. You can't know why they're doing what they're doing. You can take guesses, and it's that work of oftentimes the people I'm most interested in, if you think about gossip, if you think about all this stuff, it's people who are doing stuff that's inexplicable. They make a choice, they do a weird thing, and then you go why did they do that? Something is going on inside of them, and I must know, And then you gossip and you investigate and you look at all these things. But it is the lack of motive that actually makes people begin to feel like what on the page, what it feels like to encounter people in life. And oftentimes even in life, when people tell you, here's my motive, you go, that's not your motive, That's not really what you're doing, And then you're trying to find it. Their opacity is what makes them so vibrant. And this book that I'm looking at argues the same thing. Basically, he says that Shakespeare kind of stumbled upon this due to the history of Saxo the Grammarian and basically the stuff that he encountered, and then he repeated it over and over and over. And he was especially even interested in characters who had false motives, who were so opaque that they couldn't possibly say what it was. So his play right after Hamlet was Othello, and Othello was based, all of Shakespeare's plays, had 3 or 4 versions of it before he did it. But Othello was based on a story by the Italian Cinthio, and in Cinthio's version, Iago, like the super famous villain, was in love with Desdemona. This makes sense. This is a motive. Like, why would this character be so evil? Well, he's in love with Desdemona. Desdemona spurns him. He says, like, oh, if you're so, no one can be so pure. If you're this pure, you're probably in love with somebody else. It's probably, Othello's handsome corporal. So we're going to get rid of the corporal, and then we're going to ruin everything because I can't have you, Desdemona. And the line from Cinthio says, not only did he turn his mind to this, but the love which he had felt for the lady now turned to the bitterest hate, and he gave himself up to studying how to bring about that, once the corporal were killed, if he himself could not enjoy the lady, then the Moor should not have her either. And everything in Cinthio's story follows from the fact that Iago's jealous. Shakespeare gets rid of that. Iago doesn't care at all about Desdemona, or like, he sort of rehearses things. There's a phrase by Coleridge where he says, Coleridge, Iago sort of will soliloquize and be like, I'm doing it for this, or I'm doing it for that, and it's like completely unconvincing. Coleridge calls it the motive hunting of motiveless malignity. And then what happens in the play is all the things that happen to Othello happen, and in the end, when Othello's finally understood that he's been tricked, that Desdemona is completely innocent, and he has stabbed Desdemona and is like holding her dead body, he turns to Iago and he's basically like, why did you do this? Why did you like ruin my life? And rather than getting an answer, Iago's like, I'll never tell. That's the last we hear of Iago. It's just, nope, you don't get to know. And the specific line is, demand me nothing, what you know, from this time forth I will never speak a word. That's like the great, tragedy of Shakespeare is, I won't tell you, I'll just do one more, because I think it's worth seeing how it happens over and over and over, that the thing that you would say is the key motive to make these plays work disappears. And the effect of it is that the emotional power of the play is way, way deepened. And it's a test that you can run because we have copies of the stories without the motive, and we have copies with the story, and we can see which ones are having effects on people. The last one that's really obvious is Lear. So in Lear, in King Lear, Lear's very, very old, and he's going to retire. And the first scene, he's like, I've divided up my kingdom in 3 equal parts. I'm going to give each part to my daughter. It's all set, ready to go. It really can't be changed. This is the way it's going to be. So it's set. That's it. Okay, great. Play's over. You're going to give the kingdoms away. And then he goes, but I'm going to do a test to see if my daughters love me, right? Which already doesn't make any sense, because it's like, well, you're going to give the kingdom away in equal parts no matter what. Why are you giving a test to your daughters? You're probably not going to like what you find. It's all going to go bad. Just shut up, move on, And he does it for the first 2 daughters. It goes fine, it gives the kingdom to the first 2 daughters. So when it comes time for Cordelia, it's not like it matters what her answer is. The other 2 parts of the kingdom have already been given away. Her part is the part that's left. There's nothing left to do. There's no reason at all to do this. And then the play is staged on this happening. So then, King Lear does it. It all goes terribly, and everybody dies. And the fact that it doesn't need to happen, that reveals King Lear's interior state, that he's an older man. He feels pushed aside. He feels that he's going to be forgotten, that he can't actually know his love, and that he does this thing that's completely irrational, that makes no sense whatsoever, that as a plot doesn't really work. And that is what reveals that is what reveals who King Lear is and becomes like, a great tragic figure. In each of those cases, the thing that is taken away is what Greenblatt calls strategic opacity. That something, it's not just like everything doesn't make sense. It's that everything makes sense, everything's in place, and then one thing is strategically removed. And that strategic removal makes a space that the entire interiority of these characters are filled in. So then I got to thinking about this, and I started realizing that most of the characters I really love don't really make sense. The sort of giant characters. The first character I thought about after I read this book was I was thinking about the judge from Blood Meridian, who's this like random war god on the Cormac McCarthy created on the border of Texas, and he can like speak so many languages and knows how to like make gunpowder from piss, and is just randomly kind of giving lectures on biology in the desert, and his motivations are completely unclear, and he's terrifying because you're like, oh, like evil can just show up and exist. It can be right there. And I began to compare this to characters who did make sense. I just thought of Pan's Labyrinth after I saw that, where the villain is, the actor who plays the villain in Pan's Labyrinth is terrifying. Like just this incredible actor, like this fascist, awful, terrifying performance. And then at the end, it's like, well, his dad treated him horribly. And that, I don't want to like belittle it, but it was like, kind of like, it was explicable. It was like hurt people, it's a chain or whatever. And the kind of like cosmic evil that had been all around kind of dissipated for me, where I was like, well, I understand that, but if that's all of it, like I know how to solve that, and I know what I can solve for evil now, and that's actually not how I feel about evil. I read like, for instance, like Karl Ove Knausgaard's like 6th book, where he sort of humanizes Hitler, and the work that he was like, well, this is a person and they're making these decisions, and it's fairly nuanced. But for me, making this less opaque actually explained way less to me. It's the opacity of it that it's like, how did this happen? And the fact that I want to return to it over and over. I want to look at it this way and that way, and I want to fill in myself to be like, how could this possibly be? That gives it the power of it. If it's just like, well, he's the thwarted art student, that isn't an answer that keeps me coming back over and over, that keeps me riveted and sticky, whereas the characters who are opaque keep bringing me back. So then, for me, it was an accident. I'm going to give myself credit by comparing myself to Shakespeare and say, well, I did what Shakespeare did without even knowing it. But suddenly I had in this an explanation for why Reese wants to be a mother. The explanation is the entire book. The lack of reason, the lack of given reason for Reese to be a mother is the whole book. Just like the lack of reason for Hamlet to pretend to be mad is the entirety of Hamlet. That when you take this away, everything else in it becomes about it. The images that surround that opacity begin to fill in the opacity. And this felt like pretty incredible to me. All these things that I'd been trying to do in my writing, oftentimes with backstory, where I was like, well, why are they doing this? Like, who are they? And I would write whole backstories for these characters to explain why they might do a thing. And I started just cutting them all in this new work that I'm doing. And I found that each time I cut something and explains less, not that many people have read it, so maybe it doesn't make sense, but for me, it felt more and more kind of like epic. It felt more and more powerful. It felt more and more like, oh, these questions appear, and the missing pieces give them not just mystery, but sort of like become larger than I could ever write. Like if I wrote a backstory to explain Hamlet, suddenly Hamlet becomes a small play. Whereas if I just leave it open, it can encompass so much. And so I started cutting things away, and I've begun to try to figure out how much you can cut away to make something opaque, and what kinds of things seem to like steady that opacity, which is my craft talk, or the end of this craft talk. And in truth, I don't have the answers, because this is an ongoing process for me. This is something I'm like discovering. But I look at the places where the opacity really seems to work, and it's oftentimes surrounded by strange images. I think that Lila in the Neapolitan series, her way of behaving is very strange. She goes into these strange states, and she's such a compelling character. She's such a sticky character, precisely because she makes these inexplicable choices. I've read that book so many times, and I can't tell you why the shoes make her so mad. The Ceruleans take the shoes, and it's like, and everybody else in the book too is kind of like, just get over the shoes, And she's like, no, I'm never going to get over the shoes. I'm going to make weird art about the shoes. I'm going to do this thing. And the shoes, they're somewhat of a plot, but they seem to really be an image. They seem to be this thing that we can't understand Lila. And so whenever Lila's like strangeness comes around, her opacity comes around, we get shoes. Ferrante does this all the time, right? Like the story of the Lost Daughter, it's a doll. The doll just keeps on appearing. In The Lying Lives of Adults, it's a bracelet. The bracelet keeps on appearing. And that around the opacity, you can begin to stack images that hint towards things, but that don't actually explain it. That there's a shift between plot and image and feeling. I mean, the skull in Hamlet is like an obvious... What is that skull's name? Morick? What is it? Yeah, thank you. The decision to pretend to be mad is something like grief, something like a death drive, something like a desire not to be, which ends up being the central part of the play. And of course, there's images to sort of fill in that opacity. So those are the two sort of things that I have been working with. And so my thought to you is, I wrote, and I regret it now, having read all this stuff and having come to this thing, I wrote so many explanations in Detransition Baby for the things that the editors wanted to know. In the edits, Reese began to work at a daycare. She works at a daycare. She used to figure skate when she was a kid, and the moms used to help her. And there's all these things that I put in to please the editors. And while they were pleased and they were like, these are good character moments, I really regret them now. I feel that the fact that I had to explain motherhood and why one wants to be a mother detracted from the strangeness of the desire to be a mother. Whatever is transcendent about motherhood, whatever is kind of miraculous and sublime, goes away when I'm like, well, they're the figure skaters. That was nice. So I'm resolved to begin to not do that. And what I hope with this is that if you write a book and you get an editor, or I wish you also a option in which executives or whoever says, I really want a motive for this thing. And if the thing is like something that you're like, yeah, the character should have a motive for that, great, the motive. But if you're like, this is actually something bigger than can be answered, don't give a motive. Leave it opaque. And then be strategic about it. Leave that opacity, build everything around it, build in images, build in everything to hold that emptiness, but leave it empty. And be like this is a good ending, I didn't even mean it. Be like Iago, say, I'll never speak again. That's basically my talk on strategic opacity. Just see if I have any more notes on this. I think I should cite my source again on this. If you want to read more in depth, it is Will in the World by Stephen Greenblatt, came out in 2004. He's a new historicist scholar, I think, at Yale. So a lot of this, I wish I was like a Shakespeare scholar who could just like rattle this stuff off, and I pretended to be now for 40 minutes. But really, it's will in the world if people are looking for a more in-depth explanation of how this works. My own work that has been influenced by this idea is a short novel called Stag Dance that is going to come out in March. Thank you. It's a part of a collection of 3 novellas and a short novel. The 3 novellas are not influenced at all by this, and in fact, there is a lot of backstory. There's a lot of explanation. So, if you're interested in this more, you could, in my own work, see how it's a lumberjack. I was like, I need to follow up, do transition, baby. A lumberjack. It's the story of a lumberjack with gender issues. And thank you. The lumberjack, I had long explanations of why the lumberjack had gender issues. And then I was like, I actually have no idea why anybody has gender issues. And it's incredibly false for me to be making these backstories and stuff like that. So I'm actually going to cut them all, and I'm going to I'll choose a few images that I'll surround the lumberjack with, and just kind of leave the story to be what it is. And like I said, I haven't read it for that many people, so I don't know if it's working. But this is something that, in my own work, I'm pretty interested in, and I think I'll continue to pursue. That is my time. So thank you all so much for coming, and I really appreciate it.
Today's program was recorded at the volunteer-powered, non-commercial, listener-sponsored, full-strength makeshift home office of me, David Naiman. You can find more of Torrey Peters' work at torreypeters.com. If you enjoyed today's conversation, consider joining the Between the Covers community as a listener supporter and help keep this quixotic endeavor going into the future. Every supporter can join our brainstorm of future guests, and every listener supporter receives supplementary resources with each conversation of things I discovered while preparing, things referenced during it, and places to explore once you're done listening. Additionally, there are a variety of other potential gifts and rewards, including the bonus audio archive, which includes readings by everyone from C.A. Conrad to Matilda Bernstein Sycamore, the Tin House Early Readership subscription, getting 12 books over the course of a year, months before they're available to the general public, rare collectibles from past guests, or a bundle of books selected and curated by me and sent to you. You can find out more at patreon.com/betweenthecovers, or if you prefer a one-time donation, you can do so by PayPal at tinhouse.com/support. I'd like to thank the Tin House team, Elizabeth DeMeo and Elisa Ogie in the book division, Beth Steidel in the art department, Becky Kramer and Isabel Lemus Christensen in publicity, and Lance Cleland, the director of the summer and winter Tin House Writers Workshops. Finally, I'd like to thank past Between the Covers guests, the poet, musician, composer, performer, filmmaker, and more, Alicia Jo Rabins, for making the intro and outro for the show. You can find out more about her work at aliciajo.com, ALICIAJO.com.